I kissed a stranger to save my life, and in that second, I felt something shift that I couldn't undo. The rain hit the pavement like it had something to prove, loud, relentless, turning the city into a blur of reflections and broken light. My sneakers slipped against the wet sidewalk as I ran, breath sharp in my chest, lungs burning like I'd been holding in everything for too long. I didn't look back at first. I didn't need to. I could feel him there. The weight of his presence. The way he never really let me go, even when I walked out that door 3 nights ago with nothing but my phone and a promise to myself that I was done. My phone buzzed again in my hand, his name flashing across the screen like a warning I couldn't silence fast enough. I declined it. Again. My fingers were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "Stop running, Emily," his last message had said. Like I had a choice. Like staying had ever been safe. A car sped past, spraying water across my jeans, cold soaking through instantly, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was distance. Space. One more block. One more turn. Just somewhere public, somewhere crowded, somewhere he wouldn't make a scene. But the street ahead was nearly empty, just a few dim streetlights and the soft glow from a closed cafe. That's when I saw him. He stood perfectly still beneath the awning, untouched by the chaos around him, like the storm had decided to go around him instead. Tall. Impeccably dressed. Silver threading through dark hair that looked too deliberate to be accidental. He didn't check his phone. Didn't look around. Just stood there, calm in a way that felt unnatural, like he existed outside the noise I was drowning in. I slowed without meaning to. Something about him didn't fit. Didn't belong. And then I heard it, footsteps behind me, closer now, faster. My heart slammed hard enough to make my vision blur. I had seconds. No plan. No time to think. Just instinct. I crossed the distance between us before I could second-guess it, my hand grabbing the front of his coat, grounding myself in something solid, something real, and before I could talk myself out of it, I kissed him. It wasn't soft. It wasn't romantic. It was desperate. A silent plea wrapped in a decision I didn't understand yet. For a second, everything stopped. The rain. The noise. Even my thoughts. And then, I felt it. His hand at my waist. Steady. Certain. Not pushing me away. Holding me there. Like he had already decided something I hadn't. My heart stuttered, confusion cutting through the panic, and slowly, I pulled back just enough to breathe, to look up, to realize exactly what I had done. His eyes met mine, dark and sharp, taking me in like I was a question he already knew the answer to. No surprise. No anger. Just recognition. Like this moment meant more to him than it should have. My pulse raced under his gaze, every instinct suddenly screaming that I hadn't just made a mistake, I had stepped into something I didn't understand. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. Silence stretched, thick and heavy, and I didn't dare turn around. The man in front of me tilted his head slightly, studying me like he had all the time in the world, while mine was running out. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying a weight that made my stomach drop. "Careful," he said, his thumb brushing once against my side like a warning disguised as something gentler. "You just made this real." My breath caught on his words, like the air had suddenly thickened around us, harder to pull in, harder to hold on to, and I realized too late that I had not thought past the moment of impact, past the kiss, past the desperate need to make my ex stop chasing me, but now I was here, standing inches from a man who did not feel like a stranger anymore, not in the way that mattered, not in the way that made my instincts start to shift from panic to something quieter and far more dangerous. I swallowed, my voice barely steady as I forced out the first thing that came to mind. "I am sorry. I just needed him to stop." My words sounded small, thin against the weight of his silence, and for a second I thought he might step back, let me go, let this all dissolve into something I could pretend never happened. He did not. His hand remained at my waist, not tight, not forcing, but present in a way that made it clear he had no intention of disappearing from this moment. Behind me, I could feel the hesitation, the uncertainty, the shift in energy that meant my ex was still there, still watching, still trying to decide how to react to something he did not understand. The man in front of me did not turn around. He did not need to. "Is he yours?" he asked quietly, his eyes never leaving mine, and the question landed heavier than it should have, like it carried more meaning than the words themselves. "No," I said quickly, too quickly, my pulse jumping again. "No, he is not." A flicker of something crossed his expression, subtle, almost invisible, but I felt it, the way the air changed, the way the space around us seemed to settle into a different kind of balance. Then, finally, he shifted his gaze past me, not moving his head, just his eyes, and that was enough. I heard it then, the faint scuff of shoes against wet pavement, the sound of someone stepping back without being told to, without being touched, without anything visible forcing them to do it. My chest tightened. I did not look. I did not need to. I knew that sound. I knew what it meant. When I looked back at him, really looked this time, I noticed the details I had missed before. The precision in the way his coat fell perfectly despite the rain. The stillness in his posture, like every movement was a choice, not a reaction. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of time, yes, but also of control, of experience, of a life lived at a level I could not see but could somehow feel pressing in around me. "You ran to me," he said, not a question, just a statement, and I shook my head instinctively, even though I knew it was true. "I did not know who you were," I replied, the words slipping out before I could filter them. His gaze sharpened, just slightly, and for a second I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with being seen too clearly. "That does not change what you did," he said, his voice even, measured, like he was laying out terms I had not agreed to but was already bound by. My heart started to race again, not from running this time, but from the slow realization building underneath my ribs. "I just needed help," I said, softer now, unsure if I was explaining or pleading. He studied me for a long second, long enough that I felt every drop of rain, every beat of my pulse, every second stretching too thin, and then his hand shifted slightly, not pulling me closer, not pushing me away, just adjusting like he had decided something. "Help is never free," he said, and there was no threat in his tone, no raised voice, nothing that should have made my stomach drop the way it did, but it did anyway, sharp and immediate. Somewhere behind me, a car door closed, distant but final, and I knew without turning that the problem I had been running from was gone, at least for now, but the relief did not come. It should have. Instead, it left a hollow space that filled almost instantly with something else. Something heavier. Something that stood right in front of me, watching, waiting, like the storm had not ended at all. It had just changed direction. "What do you want?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, my voice quieter than I intended, like I already knew the answer might not be something I could walk away from. He did not answer right away. His eyes moved over my face again, slower this time, more deliberate, like he was memorizing something he planned to keep, and when he finally spoke, his voice dropped just enough to make the space between us feel smaller. "You already chose that," he said. "The moment you touched me." His words did not sound loud, but they echoed in my head like something permanent, like a line I had already crossed without realizing there was no way back, and for a moment I just stood there, trying to understand how something so simple, so desperate, had turned into something that felt this heavy, this irreversible. I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him. "That is not how this works," I said, my voice unsteady but holding on to what little control I had left. "I did not choose anything. I was trying to get away." The rain softened around us, or maybe I just stopped hearing it the same way, because everything else had narrowed down to him, to the space between us, to the way he watched me like I was not panicking at all, like I was part of a situation he already understood completely. Intent does not change outcome, he replied calmly, and there was something unsettling about how certain he sounded, like this was not new to him, like people made mistakes around him all the time and he simply decided what they meant afterward. My chest tightened. I glanced past him for the first time, just a quick look, just enough to confirm what I already felt in my bones. The street behind him was empty now. No sign of the man I had been running from. No lingering presence. Just wet pavement and distant headlights moving on like nothing had happened. Relief should have followed. It did not. Because now there was only this. I looked back at him, my pulse shifting into something slower, heavier, less frantic but more aware. Then tell me what it means, I said, and I hated how quiet my voice had become, how much it sounded like I was stepping into something instead of backing away from it. His gaze held mine, steady, unblinking, like he was measuring something deeper than my words, something I could not hide even if I tried. It means, he said after a moment, you placed yourself under my protection. The word protection landed strangely, not comforting, not threatening, just, absolute. I did not ask for that, I replied quickly, instinct pushing back even as something inside me paused. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to make the movement feel deliberate. And yet you acted, he said. In my world, actions matter more than requests. My fingers curled slightly at my sides, grounding myself, reminding myself I was still standing, still capable of walking away if I chose to. I can leave, I said, testing the words out loud, testing whether they still felt true. For the first time, something almost like amusement touched his expression, faint and controlled, gone as quickly as it appeared. You can try, he answered, not challenging, not stopping me, just stating it like a fact he had already considered. That should have made it easy. It should have given me exactly what I needed. But my feet did not move. Instead, I became hyper-aware of everything else. The quiet presence just beyond him, shapes that I had not noticed before but could feel now, like the outline of people who did not need to step forward to be known. The way the space around him seemed structured, controlled, even out here on an open street. The way he stood, not blocking my path, not forcing anything, but somehow still feeling like the center of it all. Who are you? I asked finally, because that question felt more urgent now than anything else. If I was standing in something I did not understand, I needed to know what it was. His eyes shifted slightly, not away from me, but deeper, like the answer itself carried weight. Someone you should not have needed, he said, and there was no arrogance in it, no dramatics, just a quiet certainty that made the words settle in my chest. My breath caught again, softer this time, less about fear and more about realization, the kind that builds slowly and then all at once. And now? I asked, almost afraid of the answer, almost needing it anyway. He stepped half an inch closer, not enough to invade, just enough to change the distance, to make the moment feel more defined, more intentional. Now, he said, his voice lower, steadier, you stay where you are safe. The word safe echoed differently this time, not like something I was given, but something I had been placed into, and as I stood there, soaked, exhausted, and no longer running, I realized something I had not expected. For the first time that night, my hands had stopped shaking. Not because everything was over, but because whatever came next, was already here. I should have stepped back when he said that, should have taken the opening he gave me and walked away before whatever this was became something I could not control, but my feet stayed planted like the ground had quietly shifted under me, like leaving was no longer as simple as turning around and putting distance between us. The rain had softened into a steady whisper, sliding off the edge of the awning in thin streams, and I became aware of how cold I was, how soaked my clothes were, how my hair clung to my face, but none of it seemed as important as the way he was still looking at me, waiting without pressure, like he knew I had not made a decision yet even if I thought I had. Safe is relative, I said finally, my voice steadier now, not because I felt stronger, but because I needed to sound like I did. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes acknowledged the statement, like I had said something worth considering. "It is," he agreed, his tone even, unbothered by the implication. "But it is still better than the alternative." The alternative. I did not need him to explain that. I had just lived it. My chest tightened slightly as the memory of running, of not knowing if I would make it another block without being caught in a conversation I could not win, flickered through my mind. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself back into the present. "And what happens if I decide I do not want your version of safe?" I asked, testing the boundary again, needing to know where it actually was. For a moment, he said nothing, and the silence stretched just enough to make me question if I had pushed too far, but then he shifted his gaze slightly, not away from me, just outward, like he was taking in the space around us before returning his focus completely. "Then you walk away," he said simply, and the lack of resistance in his answer should have been reassuring, but it was not. It felt calculated. Like he was giving me exactly what I needed to hear, not because he believed I would take it, but because he knew something I did not. I hesitated, my fingers tightening slightly at my sides, and for the first time since this started, I took a small step back. The distance between us increased by maybe half a foot, nothing significant, but enough to feel like movement, enough to test if anything would change. It did not. He did not follow. Did not reach for me. Did not stop me. He just watched, calm, composed, like the outcome of this moment was already decided somewhere beyond my understanding. My heart picked up again, not from fear this time, but from the strange awareness that I was being given a choice that did not feel like one. I glanced down the street, toward the direction I had come from, toward the city that suddenly felt larger, more uncertain than it had 20 minutes ago. Everything looked the same. The streetlights. The wet pavement. The distant hum of traffic. But I did not feel the same standing in it. Something had shifted, quietly but completely. I looked back at him, searching for something I could define, something I could hold on to that made sense. "Why me?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because that was the part one could not understand. There had been nothing special about that moment. Nothing intentional. Just panic and a bad decision. His gaze softened, just slightly, not in a way that made him less intimidating, but in a way that made him more certain. "Because you chose me when it mattered," he said, and the simplicity of the answer made it land harder than anything else he had said so far. I shook my head instinctively. "I did not know who you were," I repeated, needing him to understand that, needing it to matter. "Exactly," he replied, and this time there was something else in his voice, something quieter, something that almost sounded like approval. "That is why it counts." The words settled into the space between us, heavier than they should have been, and I felt my breath catch again, not from fear, not from confusion, but from the slow, creeping realization that whatever line I thought I could step back across, might not exist anymore. I looked down at my hands, noticing for the first time that they were no longer shaking at all, and when I looked back up at him, the question forming in my mind was different now, less about leaving and more about understanding what staying would mean. "If I stay," I said carefully, choosing each word like it mattered, "what happens next?" He held my gaze, steady, unwavering, like he had been waiting for that exact question, like everything before this had been leading here, and when he answered, his voice was low, controlled, carrying that same quiet certainty that had followed him from the moment I saw him. "Then you stop running," he said. "And you learn the rules." The word rules settled into my chest. Like something heavier than it should have been, not sharp, not immediate, just there, pressing slowly inward as I tried to understand what he meant without asking the question that would make it more real. I exhaled quietly, my breath still uneven from everything that had happened, from the running, the fear, the sudden shift into something I could not name. "What kind of rules?" I asked, my voice softer now, not defiant, not entirely uncertain, just careful. He watched me for a moment, like he was deciding how much to say, how much I needed to hear right now instead of later, and then he moved for the first time in a way that felt like direction. Not toward me. Past me. Just one step, enough to change the angle between us, enough to shift the moment forward. The kind that keep you alive, he said calmly, and there was no emphasis in his tone, no dramatics, just a quiet certainty that made the words land deeper than if he had raised his voice. My stomach tightened slightly at that, not from fear exactly, but from the realization that whatever world he belonged to, it was not one where rules were optional. I turned slightly as he did, following the shift, noticing now what I had only felt before. A car waited at the curb, dark, understated, the kind you would not look at twice unless you knew what to look for. The engine was already running, steady and low, like it had been there longer than I realized. Two men stood near it, not moving, not speaking, but present in a way that made the space feel structured, controlled. They did not look at me directly, but I could feel their awareness, the same way I felt his. I did not agree to anything, I said, the words coming out before I could stop them, because I needed to hold on to that, needed to say it out loud so it still felt true. He paused, just slightly, then looked back at me over his shoulder, his expression unchanged. "You are still here," he replied, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because he was right. I had not walked away. Not when I could have. Not when he gave me the space to. My fingers tightened again, not from panic this time, but from the slow awareness that my choices were not as clear as I wanted them to be. I glanced down the street again, half expecting something to pull me back, some reason to leave that felt stronger than the unknown in front of me, but there was nothing. Just the city moving on, indifferent, like it always did. When I looked back at him, he was watching me again, not impatient, not pushing, just waiting in a way that felt deliberate. "If I get in that car," I said slowly, each word measured, "that is not just a ride, is it?" His gaze held mine, steady and unflinching, and for a second I thought he might avoid the question, might soften it into something easier to accept, but he did not. "No," he said simply. "It is not." The honesty in that answer should have made this easier. It did not. It made it clearer. And somehow that made it harder to ignore. I swallowed, my heart beating in a slower, heavier rhythm now, not racing, just aware. "And if I do not?" I asked, needing to hear it, needing to know what walking away actually meant now that everything had shifted. He stepped closer again, not enough to close the distance completely, just enough to bring the focus back to him, to the space we were still sharing. "Then you go back to what you were running from," he said, and there was no threat in it, no pressure, just a statement of fact that left no room for illusion. My breath caught slightly at that, because I knew he was right. I had seen enough to understand that whatever had been chasing me was not something that would simply disappear because I wanted it to. I looked at the car again, at the quiet presence of the men beside it, at the open door now waiting without urgency, and then back at him. "You make it sound simple," I said, my voice quieter now, less defensive, more honest. Something shifted in his expression again, subtle but real, like he recognized the change even before I did. "It is simple," he replied. "It is just not easy." The words lingered between us, steady and undeniable, and for the first time since this started, I realized that the choice in front of me was not about right or wrong, not about fear or safety, but about which version of uncertainty I was willing to step into. My hand moved slightly at my side, not reaching, not committing, just considering, and when I looked at him again, really looked, I saw something I had missed before. Not just control. Not just power. But patience. The kind that came from knowing the outcome did not need to be rushed. "Emily," he said, my name quiet but precise, grounding me in the moment in a way nothing else had, and I blinked slightly, surprised he knew it without asking. "Do not overthink the first step," he continued. "Just decide if you are done running." The question settled deep, cutting through everything else, and I stood there for one more second, feeling the rain, the cold, the weight of the night pressing in around me, before something inside me shifted into place. Not certainty. Not comfort. Just a decision. My feet moved before I could second-guess it, one step forward, closing the distance between where I was and where he had been waiting all along. The moment my foot crossed that invisible line, something in the air shifted, not louder, not heavier, just settled, like a decision had been recognized by something beyond me, and I felt it in the way his posture changed, barely noticeable but real, like he had been waiting for that exact movement and now everything could continue. He did not smile. He did not say anything right away. He simply turned, opening the car door himself with a smooth, unhurried motion that felt more intentional than anything else he had done so far. Not rushed. Not forced. Just expected. I hesitated for half a second, my hand hovering near the door, aware of how small the action was and how much it seemed to carry, and then I leaned forward and stepped inside. The interior was warm, quiet, insulated from the rain and the city in a way that felt almost unreal, like I had stepped into a different version of the night where everything outside no longer applied. The door closed behind me with a soft, final sound that echoed louder in my head than it should have. I sat still for a moment, hands resting in my lap, trying to catch up to what I had just done, to the fact that I was now sitting in a stranger's car, willingly, with no clear idea of where I was going or what came next. The driver did not turn around. The men outside did not speak. Everything moved without noise, without hesitation, like this was routine for them. A second later, he slid into the seat beside me, the space shifting again, smaller now, more defined, and I became aware of him in a different way, not just as a presence in front of me, but as something solid, close, impossible to ignore. "Seatbelt," he said quietly, not looking at me, his tone calm but carrying that same underlying expectation. I blinked once, then reached for it automatically, the click sounding louder than it should have in the quiet interior. The car began to move almost immediately, smooth and controlled, merging back into the rhythm of the city like we had always been part of it. I stared out the window for a second, watching the streetlights blur past, the reflection stretching across the glass, and for the first time since I got in, the weight of what I had done settled fully into my chest. I turned slightly toward him, my voice quieter now, not because I was afraid, but because everything felt more serious here, more contained. "Where are we going?" I asked. He did not answer right away. His gaze was forward, focused, like the question did not require urgency, like the answer was already understood even if I did not know it yet. "Somewhere you can rest," he said finally, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard again, because it was not what I expected, not what I had prepared myself for. "That is all?" I asked, a small edge of disbelief slipping through before I could stop it. He turned his head slightly then, just enough for his eyes to meet mine, steady and unreadable. "For now," he replied. The words lingered, soft but deliberate, and I felt something in my chest shift again, not easing, not tightening, just adjusting, like I was beginning to understand that whatever this was, it was not going to unfold all at once. I looked away first, back toward the window, watching the city change as we moved through it, from crowded streets to quieter ones, from noise to something more controlled, more distant. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, eyes wide, hair damp, expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and something I could not quite name. "You knew my name," I said after a moment, the thought returning now that everything else had slowed down. "You did not ask." His gaze did not shift this time, but I felt the faintest change in the air beside me, like the question had weight. "I make it a point to know who stands in front of me," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, just a matter-of-fact tone that made it clear this was normal for him, expected. I swallowed slightly, turning that over in my mind, realizing that to him, this moment was not chaos, not confusion, just another situation he had already begun to understand and control. "And what do you know about me?" I asked, the question coming out slower, more careful now, because I was not sure I wanted the answer but needed to hear it anyway. He was quiet for a second, and I felt the pause more than I heard it, like he was choosing what mattered. "Enough to know you were running from something that would not stop," he said, his voice low, steady, and something about the way he said it made it feel less like an observation and more like a conclusion he had already reached. My fingers tightened slightly in my lap, not from fear this time, but from the strange feeling of being seen again, not in the way I was used to, not in the way that made me want to hide, but in a way that made everything feel clearer, sharper, harder to ignore. The car slowed slightly as we turned onto a quieter street, the lights fewer, the buildings taller, more private, and I felt it then, the final shift from what I knew into something else entirely. I glanced at him one more time, searching his expression for something familiar, something predictable, but all I found was the same calm certainty that had followed him from the beginning. "And now?" I asked quietly, the question softer than before, less about escape and more about what came next. He did not look at me this time. His gaze stayed forward, focused on the road ahead as the car came to a slow, controlled stop. "Now," he said, his voice even, grounded, "you learn what staying means." The car came to a complete stop, smooth and controlled, like everything else about him, and for a second I did not move, my hand still resting lightly on the seat beside me as I tried to catch up to the moment, to the quiet finality of arriving somewhere I had not chosen but had still walked into. Outside, the rain had slowed to a light mist, barely visible under the soft glow of overhead lights that lined the entrance of a building that did not look loud or extravagant, but carried a kind of presence that did not need to prove itself. Tall glass doors. Clean lines. No visible signs. Just quiet security and the sense that not everyone was meant to walk through them. The driver stepped out first, moving without hesitation, opening the door on my side before I could reach for it myself. I paused for half a second, then stepped out, my shoes meeting dry pavement this time, the difference almost jarring after the chaos of the street I had left behind. The air felt different here. Still. Controlled. Like the outside world had been filtered before it was allowed in. He stepped out beside me, adjusting his coat with a simple motion that somehow made everything feel more formal, more intentional, and I became aware again of the distance between who I was and wherever this place belonged. "Stay close," he said quietly, not looking at me, already moving toward the entrance, and I followed without thinking, my steps slower at first, then matching his pace as the doors opened before we reached them. No one asked questions. No one hesitated. We were expected. That realization settled somewhere deep, not frightening, just clear. Inside, the space was warm, polished, silent in a way that made every sound feel deliberate. Marble floors. Soft lighting. The faint scent of something expensive but subtle. I glanced around instinctively, trying to take it in, trying to understand where I was, but nothing about it gave me easy answers. It was not a hotel. Not exactly. Not anything I had been in before. "This is not my world," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, but he heard it anyway. "It is not supposed to be," he replied, his tone even, not dismissive, just factual, and something about that made me look at him again, really look this time, not as the man I had run into, but as someone who existed fully in this space without question. We moved toward a private elevator, one that opened immediately as we approached, and I hesitated for half a second before stepping in, the enclosed space suddenly making everything feel closer, more real. He stood beside me, not touching, not crowding, but present in a way that filled the silence without effort. "You can leave at any time," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost thoughtful, and I turned to look at him, surprised by the statement after everything that had happened. "That does not feel true," I replied honestly, because it did not anymore, not after the choices I had already made. He held my gaze for a moment, then looked forward again as the elevator began to move. "It is," he said, "but it becomes harder the longer you stay." The word settled heavily, not as a warning, not as a threat, just reality, and I felt that again, that quiet shift inside me, the one that had started the moment I stepped into his space and had not stopped since. The elevator doors opened onto a private floor, the hallway quiet, minimal, leading to a single door at the end that opened before we reached it. Inside, the space was larger than I expected, but not overwhelming, just precise, everything in its place, everything intentional. Warm light. Clean lines. A sense of control that mirrored him exactly. I stepped inside slowly, my eyes moving across the room, trying to process it, trying to understand what staying here would mean beyond just the physical space. "You can dry off," he said, gesturing slightly toward a side room, his tone unchanged, practical, like this was the next logical step and nothing more. I nodded without speaking, my mind still catching up, my body moving before my thoughts fully settled, and as I took a step further inside, I realized something that stopped me just long enough to notice it. I was no longer thinking about running. Not because I could not. But because for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I needed to. I stood still in the center of the room for a moment after he left, listening to the soft click of the door closing behind him, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything outside had been, not empty, but structured, like even quiet here had a purpose. My clothes were still damp from the rain, but I did not move right away, my eyes slowly adjusting to the space around me, noticing details I had not registered before, the precision of it, the absence of anything unnecessary, the kind of order that did not feel decorative but enforced. I exhaled slowly, finally stepping further inside, my fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of the chair near me as if I needed something physical to confirm I was not still outside on the street. A soft knock at the interior door broke the silence, not urgent, just controlled, and before I could respond, it opened slightly and a woman stepped in. She was calm, professional, dressed simply, her expression neutral in a way that felt practiced rather than cold. "You can change into these," she said gently, holding out a folded set of dry clothes. I hesitated for a second, looking at her, then at the clothes, then back again, unsure of what exactly I was supposed to say in a place where everything was already decided before I arrived. "Thank you," I said finally, taking them slowly, my voice quieter than I intended. She nodded once, then stepped back out without another word, closing the door behind her with the same controlled precision as everything else here. I stood there holding the clothes, suddenly aware of how real this was, how far I had moved from the street, from the rain, from the moment I had made a choice without fully understanding what followed it. I changed in silence, my movements slow, almost careful, as if speed might make this feel less real, but it did not. When I returned, he was already there again, standing near the window, looking out at the city below like it belonged to him in a way that did not require attention or effort. He did not turn immediately when I entered, and that alone felt like a kind of control, not over me, but over everything else in the room. "Better," he said after a moment, his eyes still forward, and I looked down slightly at the clothes, simple, neutral, nothing that made me stand out, nothing that made me feel like I had been placed here by accident. "What happens now?" I asked, not because I expected a simple answer, but because silence here felt like it carried meaning I was not yet fluent in. He turned then, slowly, his gaze settling on me with the same calm focus as before, and I realized again how little he moved unnecessarily, how every action seemed measured, intentional. "Now you understand the choice you made," he said. I frowned slightly, stepping a little further into the room, needing clarity more than comfort. "I chose to stop running," I said carefully, testing the words. He nodded once, acknowledging it without correction. "And that choice has consequences," he replied. The word consequences did not sound like punishment in his voice. It sounded like structure, like something already in motion. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike, which unsettled me more than fear would have. "You are not keeping me here," I said, more firmly this time, needing that boundary to still exist somewhere. He studied me for a moment, then walked slowly toward the center of the room, stopping at a distance that still respected space, still maintained control without closing it. "I am not holding you," he said evenly. "I am offering you a place where what is chasing you cannot reach you the same way it did before." I looked at him, trying to find the catch, the hidden edge in the words, but there was none in his tone, only certainty, and that was what made it difficult. "And what do you get from this?" I asked quietly, because nothing in my experience said safety came without cost. His gaze did not waver. "Clarity," he said simply. The answer did not help in the way I expected. Instead, it made everything more defined, more structured, like I was beginning to see the outline of something much larger than the moment I was standing in. I walked slowly toward the window then, not too close, just enough to see the city spread out beneath us, lights stretching into the distance, people moving through lives I no longer felt fully connected to. "I do not understand this world," I admitted after a moment, my voice quieter now, less defensive, more honest. "You do not need to yet," he said, and when I turned slightly, I saw him watching me again, not assessing, not calculating, just present in a way that made it hard to ignore. "You only need to decide if you are willing to stay long enough to learn it." The words settled between us, not heavy, not light, just final in a way that did not demand urgency. I looked back out at the city, at everything I had left behind without fully realizing I was doing it, and for the first time since the night began, I did not feel like I was falling. I felt like I had already landed somewhere new. I stood by the window longer than I expected, watching the city move far below like it belonged to another version of my life, one where everything still made sense in simple lines, where danger had names I understood and choices came with clear exits. Behind me, I could feel his presence without needing to turn around, not close, not intrusive, just steady, like he had decided that silence was part of the conversation now. "You are quiet," he said after a while, his voice calm, almost observational, and I realized he was not asking me to respond, just noting the change in me as if it mattered. I exhaled slowly, folding my arms lightly, trying to find words that did not feel like I was giving something away I could not take back. "I am thinking," I said honestly. He nodded once, as if that answer made sense to him, as if thinking was something he had expected from the beginning. The room felt different now than it had when I first walked in. Less unfamiliar. Less like I had been dropped into it by mistake. More like I was beginning to understand its edges. "About what happens next," I added after a moment, still facing the glass. There was a pause, not heavy, just intentional, like he was choosing the shape of his response rather than reacting to the question. "Next is simple," he said finally. I turned slightly then, just enough to see him more clearly, his posture unchanged, his attention steady. "You stop reacting to fear," he continued, "and you start recognizing structure." The words should have sounded cold, but they did not. They sounded like instruction, like something meant to be learned rather than endured. I frowned slightly, stepping away from the window now, moving slowly back into the center of the room, needing distance from the glass, from the height, from the feeling of watching my old life shrink below me. "Structure does not sound like freedom," I said quietly. His gaze shifted to me then, fully, without distraction, and I felt that same quiet pressure again, not forcing, just defining. "Freedom without safety is only movement," he replied. "You have already lived that version." I did not answer immediately because I knew he was right, and that was harder to accept than disagreement. My thoughts drifted back to the street, the rain, the running, the way every direction had felt the same because none of them led anywhere stable. "And what about him?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could fully stop it. He did not ask who I meant. He simply answered. "He is no longer your concern." The certainty in his tone did not feel like threat. It felt like conclusion. I studied him carefully then, searching for something that would make this feel like manipulation or illusion or anything I could push away easily, but all I found was consistency. Control, yes, but not chaos. "I did not choose this life," I said quietly, though even as I said it, I realized it no longer felt entirely true. "You chose to stop running," he corrected gently, not challenging, just aligning the words with something I had already done. That landed differently this time. Not as pressure, but as recognition. I looked down at my hands again, noticing how still they were now compared to earlier, how my body had begun to accept stillness where panic used to live. The silence between us stretched, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It felt structured, like everything here. Finally, I looked back up at him. If I stay, I said carefully, what am I actually becoming part of? He took a slow step closer, not closing distance entirely, just enough that I could no longer pretend. This was abstract. A world where you are not hunted, he said, and where your choices are no longer dictated by fear. I let that sit, feeling the weight of it without resisting it immediately, because something in me already knew what it meant to go back, and something else, quieter, already understood what it might mean to remain. For the first time that night, I did not feel like I was being pulled in any direction. I felt like I was finally standing still long enough to decide where I wanted to exist.